Who's got the question? Hi, and thank you so much today for joining us for our March segment of the Financial Town Hall Just Ask Jen. We are super excited that you are here with us today, and as we talk about money. And we are joined on stage by my colleague to the right,
Eve Bolton, board member.
AKA Trouble. And also
Jennifer Wagner, the Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer. Good evening, everyone.
So just to go over like a quick setup, if you are interested in engaging with us or you happen to have any questions, we've got a whole room full of people today. So please feel free to join us in person, or if you're on Blue Jeans, and we do have Blue Jeans, if you're on Blue Jeans and you want to submit a question, we're taking it there. And we're also on Facebook. So please feel free to put your questions there too, and we will get to them. We've got some great team members in the audience who will be able to help facilitate those questions online. Today we are talking about state and federal grants. We know that you have tons of questions, and so we're ready to answer. Jen, cue us up.
Good evening, everyone. So if you'll bring my PowerPoint up. So today we promised to talk about state and federal grants as part of our education, if you will, on where our funds come from. And so because we spend a majority of our time and our dollars on general funds, we thought we would take a few moments tonight to talk about our state and federal grants. And so if you go ahead and flip to the next slide. I just have a couple little introductory slides to share. So this is a pie chart of all the funding sources. The big blue section is the general fund, as we've discussed in previous segments, and everything else. So it's another 36% that we receive from our state and federal grants. What looks so odd with this is this year we show $194 million in ESSER funds. So the multi-year grant was $325 million, but we've spent down quite a bit of that. So this year's allocation is $194. And so that kind of shades the percentages a little bit. So in here on this particular pie chart, the general fund represents 63% and state and federal are 36%. But when you remove the impact of ESSER, the general fund represents 80% of our revenues and the state and federal represents 20%. Just that because ESSER was so big, it had a proportional impact. So if you hit the next slide. And this slide shows you, while we receive a lot of state and federal grants, we do share that money as pass-through to our non-public schools. And so I'm showing you from the state grants perspective, I think there's 10 of them up there, that while we receive $16 million, $9 million goes to the non-publics for the state grants. And that's the biggest majority of that's auxiliary fund, which is directly goes to them, pass through us. I don't know what it is about every time I get up here, my voice gets really raspy. And then, so we shared with them state and federal grants, and then some of the ESSER funds, the early ESSER funds, we had to share with our non-public partners as well. But so you can see from the pie chart, we do have the lion's share of those funds because we have the lion's share of those students. Okay, so next slide. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about kind of our top 3 biggest grants, because that's what has an impact on our students. So the first one, the biggest state and federal, actually it's a federal grant, is Title I. We've had lots of questions about Title I in this year's budget cycle, and we talked a lot about how schools qualify for eligibility, but the allocation to CPS is $22.5 million. 3.5 of that goes to our non-public partners. And the purpose of that is to provide high quality education for students with achievement gaps, which is different than it was years ago. Years ago, it was more about poverty. And so now it's focusing on achievement gaps. So now you qualify based on the poverty indexes that the state and federal, they calculate for us, but it's to target the students that are struggling academically.
Before you go to the next slide, can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what how do we give we have a non-public allocation. What would we be giving to our non-public schools with that money?
So the state tells us how much money to give them. That's not that's not our decision, and they do that. But for hiring reading teachers and curriculum, and they buy technology with it and instructional supplies and teachers.
Okay.
So there's a lot. They have to follow the same rules we do in terms of qualifying expenditures. So it has to be targeted to those students that are most disadvantaged achievement-wise.
So the state gives us money and says, oh, you're going to give part of this to your private schools, your charter schools. Too.
Right.
Okay, so not only transportation do we have to provide for non-pubs, we also have to provide them Title I funding,
That's
a portion
correct.
of our Title I funding too.
And parts of our other fundings as well.
Okay.
So that's Title I, $22 million, and it's allocated to our schools based on a per pupil value, and it's stepped. So depending on, so the groups of schools, the highest step is the highest poverty grouping of schools, and they get a higher value per pupil than the less economically disadvantaged students do. So it's a range. And then they're given some qualifying things that they're allowed to spend the money on. Because we're no longer in the pool, the rules on the spending get a little bit more restrictive. Because remember, when we were in the school-wide pool, the funds lost their identity when they entered the pool, so we had a little bit more freedom on what schools could buy. So now that we're outside the pool, they have to really follow those restrictive rules, and it's been a challenge this year. Re-educate everybody on the new rules. Okay, so next slide is idea B, I believe. Oh, sorry. Because I'm a geek and I like pictures and numbers, I'm showing you that this is how we spend that Title I money, our allocation, the $22 million. Most of it goes to personnel in terms of reading, math specialists, coaches, curriculum, and actually some of our curriculum managers that are cost allocated into Title. Do you have a question, Ms. Bolton?
Yes. What else could it be spent on besides personnel?
Curriculum, supplemental supplies, activities that would be supplemental. So the rule between federal funds are supposed to supplement what we already do, base formula. So what does every child in our district deserve? A regular ed teacher, or if they're in a self-contained classroom, a teacher. Curriculum, textbooks, transportation, if they're eligible. So those things the general fund has to spend money on. You're supposed to use your Title I funds to add on to that. So, and it can only be used in title schools. So if it's something that you want to do district-wide, like a district-wide curriculum, you can't use title funds to do it because you'll have non-title schools that need access to that curriculum. Okay, so it has to be something that's targeted to this Title I schools and those specific needs, and it's supplemental to what the district is already obligated to do. So if it's written into the collective bargaining agreement, the general fund has to pay for it.
I could. Then it's going to Title I schools rather than to Title I students.
It goes to Title I schools, and the budgets they build is supposed to address what we call the one plan, which is based on a needs assessment, and it's all based on the student outcomes of where their weaknesses are. So if one school showed that they had a significant weakness in math, then their one plan should address, I'm going to spend my Title I money to help hire math tutors or after school math programming or some new math curriculum that nobody else has access or non-title schools don't have access to.
But reviewing something we talked about, I guess, last month, and one of the issues of this budget process is that if a school has a certain number or percentage of students that were individually qualifying because of the economic issues, does that school get Title I dollars because they have Title I students?
No, they have to meet a threshold. So the law says that we have to serve any school that is over 70% free and reduced lunch. The district chooses to go to a lower level to 40%. So if there's a school that's below that 40% of their population, based on the timing of when they do the measure, when ODE does a measure in June and not like yesterday, then they don't qualify for title funds. Should they jump over that threshold in the next year, their first year is always considered a targeted year, which they don't have the same school-wide freedom that other schools do. They have to follow a ranked order of students. They have to actually rank their students in order of need, whatever the academic need is, and serve those kids first. And then they have a list of things that they can use to spend money on. Does that make sense?
Yes, and so it's possible that some of our schools are at 40% and would be receiving some Title I dollars.
For example, SCPA just last June went over the 40% number. And so this fiscal year coming up, fiscal year 24, is the targeted planning year for them. So they have to, the first year is a planning year, and they get small dollars of title money to spend on those targeted students. And then while they plan for their school-wide funding for the next year.
And who determines it? It's not the school. This who at status.
Right. So my understanding is the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services provides the data based on direct certification to ODE. ODE enters that information into our application, and so the data comes from them. It doesn't come from us. For funding, it's different for feeding, for the feeding program, the food service program. They can take in information for like the paper applications and migrant students and homelessness, and so they have more access to more information to be able to provide food for students. But we have to follow the federal data that they enter into the application for us.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I'm sorry, I wanted to piggyback off of that for
It's
just one
okay.
second.
These are
'Cause I
great
still have
questions.
some questions. So when you say ODJFS, Department of Jobs and Family Services, provides the data based on certifications, I'm kind of confused. So is it that our parents are submitting the forms and that's what's determining the eligibility for Title I? Because I don't know, it just doesn't feel accurate, because we have some parents, if that's just, there's absolutely no checks and balances to the categorization, that could be problematic. If I just say that I make $20,000 a year, but there's no check or balance, or I don't even fill out the form, how is that accurate?
So I don't know exactly how ODJFS collects their data. I do know it has something to do with the census and how they can qualify like housing students under the same house, regardless whether they have the same last name or not. But they take that data and they use a multiplier of 1.6. So let's just say that I had 38%. As a school, my school had 38% of my population that qualified under direct certification. They would increase that through the index, the 1.6 multiplier, to get me over that 40%. That multiplier is intended to cover for the people that don't fill out the paperwork. So they're saying that they're having trouble getting people to submit. And so they use that 1.6 multiplier kind of make up that difference. So here's our raw data, and we're going to increase it for you. But how they collect that data, I may have known a year ago, 12 years ago, but I don't remember now.
Okay, well, maybe we can do
We can invite our dining services director to one of these town halls. Yeah.
Absolutely. And my other question is, just to, again, piggyback off of what Board Member Bolton shared, if we have a school that is, let's say, 30%, but they happen to have students, excuse me, who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, they're not getting any title money.
That's correct.
So what we're doing is allowing students to go to whatever schools they choose, but we're not providing them the supplementals if they qualify, because they don't meet any of the minimum qualifications from the state for title funding.
The school doesn't qualify for those funds, so that's correct.
Do we offer any other supplementals for those students who are at schools that are at the 40% or below?
So we can't do that, because then it becomes a supplant, and then I can't use title funds to do what I have to do in the Title I schools.
Well, no, I'm not talking about the title funding. I'm talking about if the title funding is going to the title schools, but we have students who would qualify for title funding, but they're not in title funded schools, are they getting any supplemental services from any of our other resources to cover the supplements that they would qualify for, but they just happen to be in a school that doesn't get extra funding? So if I'm in, let's say I'm in, well, let's just talk about Fairview, because Fairview's sent a lot of information. So let's say Fairview is at 39%, and they've got 20% of their students are getting, or would qualify for title funding. Are we giving any type of supplemental services to those 20% of students that we know would be eligible if they were in a different school, but they're not?
We don't have a funding source to do that. The school has a responsibility to take their budgetary dollars and create a budget that supports the needs of their students. So if they have a specific need, then they have to use the funds that they have available to them to try to figure that out. I can't work outside the title funds because then it breaks the rules for the title schools, and then we end up having to pay that money back.
No. I was never suggesting that we take title money away from. I was talking about what are we doing with regard to our general fund, or are there any other?
So let's just use a practical example. So let's say we had a new reading software program that we wanted because we had a weakness in third grade reading. And so we give it to all of our title schools. I can't then go do a third grade reading program at Fairview because that becomes a supplant.
Right.
Even though the students might have some of the students in Fairview might have the same need as one of the schools that might be at 45%, the funding doesn't allow us to do that. Shall we take questions from the public? So we've been chatting for a while.
Do we have any questions from the public?
Anybody from?
You look like you were.
I know, I didn't mean to cut you off, but.
No.
Well, while he's looking that up, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I think to follow up on the other question regarding supplanting or whatever, we are unable to use our general fund dollars to provide maybe a different program to those kids that would normally be Title I but are not in a Title I school. Is that what you're saying? Or
that's my understanding.
That was my question. Why can't we just?
It's something that we can submit, and then we can ask our compliance team that specific question.
I'm not talking about using title money. I'm
I know.
talking about if title money's gone and it's allocated to title schools, but we know that there are students who are title eligible in our schools. We're not doing anything for that population, but they're also they're weighting our scores, but we're not providing any supplemental services to them. Does that make sense? So if we know that, if back to my example, if a school is at 35% that doesn't qualify for title funding, but if 20% of their population is title eligible, they just happen to be in a school that's not receiving title funding, what are we doing to supplement them? Because we know that they need that extra academic support, because that's the purpose of title funding, is to close the gap. So we're not allowing for any space in the general fund, or where are we allowing for space?
So probably answering the supplemental services question should probably come from the academic team instead of the financial team. I had a thought. No, I lost it. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
It'll come back to me.
That's a good question for the board. I didn't realize that we weren't I really didn't understand until you just shared that we have schools that have students who are not eligible to receive supplemental services that they would qualify.
So I'm not in a position to say that they're not getting any supplemental services. Okay. I'm just saying that we're following the funding model that we have to follow.
I got you.
Okay. I don't want to misspeak or misrepresent.
I think it's an interesting point from a standpoint. First of all, could we as a local district go lower than 40%? Or is,
We could, but our $22 million, it does not go up. So it just
Right.
means everybody gets a little bit less.
right.
And if that's what we want to do for the district, or come up with some kind of different weighting, then we can do that. But that's not the model that we've adopted.
Because to me, part of it with our great diversity, but also with our great concentration of poverty, if you will, and economically disadvantaged situations, it would seem to me it almost forces one to concentrate economically disadvantaged kids into particular schools
Correct.
instead of doing what we want to do, which is achieve this great diversity that we're beginning to see. Just like the overload pay is really subsidizing large classes because we have. I mean, I'm not being facetious. It's just
I know.
we do things that they make complete sense, especially from a financial standpoint. But it also it's why maybe the public would know too that this has been a particularly trying year for school budgets because of ending pooling and trying to do really interesting and big things. But it seems like we exacerbate or concentrate our own problems a bit.
So recall several years ago, being called a Title I school was a negative. And so things have changed because the world changed.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily the case anymore, but it's that part of it was more of a, well, it was, but the change in attitude and philosophy was kind of a surprise when it comes to building the financial, because we had not heard that in the finance team until after we were partway through the staffing. And what's exacerbating this whole thing, if you'll recall, is that we held on to staff with our COVID funds to help support everybody because we were confident that all our students would return to us because we still believe we're the best competitive educational service out there. And so in some grade levels that like our preschool is beyond where we ever were. We're over 2,000 kids. But not all grades have rebounded. And so because those funds are, that wasn't part of our 3-year phase down, our cliff plan. And now the schools are feeling that pain of returning back to normal funding operations. We may not end up finishing there, but that's where we are. And so we have some, decisions to make on how to better support financially.
Maybe one question that I have that I'm just sitting here is how many of our schools are not title funded? And I know that probably is
I want to say
unfair.
12. I'm looking at my colleagues in the audience. I could probably rattle them off for you, but I think it's 10 or 12.
It's hard to see all your colleagues
I know.
through the crowd that we.
I know, you guys move over, let them all be.
don't
I used
stand
to have them all memorized, but I think it's 10 or 12. The majority of our are. But this is a fascinating conversation because the Title I model flies in the face of equity.
Absolutely.
And so we tend to use, we are trying to use the Title Is to meet the equity, but it prevents you from doing equity funding in the non-title schools.
And that's something perhaps that we could change this year.
How did I know
Like
you were going to go
maybe
there?
tomorrow.
So yes, there's a lot of reasons why that you can't turn the ship around that quickly, but I am certainly open
Maybe
to
if a
trying.
PT boat maybe would be a little bit better analogy than
Well, I think the biggest caveat for me is that we work on it. We address it, we are aware of it, and that we work on it. I really am kind of concerned in those. I would love to look at the scores and the data from those 12 schools that are title eligible but not title funded, and then see what options we could do as a board to supplement. And I'm interested in the scores of those students because if they're eligible for supplemental services that they probably really need, but they're not getting them, what impact is that
Right.
having on them and us as a district academically?
the other piece of that is if we look school by school by school, first of all, generally the rating of the school is very much aligned to poverty and economic well-being.
Right.
And so we know that, and that's very unfortunate and very difficult to overcome. But it would be interesting too if in those schools that are non-title schools, if the kids that qualify for title are doing better in those schools, then they might be where there's a concentration, then that begins to emphasize again the need for the diversification of the enrollment in each building.
Yeah, I'm actually loving, even though as challenging as these questions are, especially when you're doing it in front of a camera, but yeah, this unruly audience. But this is the movement of the return on investment and putting the dollars where they make the most sense academically, right? And so the conversation we were having earlier, so the public doesn't know this, but several of us have taken this class from Georgetown University called Egenomics, and it's been helping everybody look at your spend based on a per pupil value. I have some issue with looking at everything on a per pupil value because not everything is variable based on the number of students. So I think that could be misleading. You can footnote it or whatever, but it's fascinating because the conversation we had earlier, Dr. Moffitt asked me, well, can we get a per pupil spend and then tie it to student outcomes? I'm like, man, that's a return on investment if I never heard of it. So it's great. The whole district is moving in this direction, but I'm going to tell you, I've never had a board that's been interested. We've never even had conversations about state and federal grant budgets. And so this is like a new board, a new method of allocating financial resources, and it's really exciting.
I'm so glad.
It's just not going to happen overnight.
Well, with the extra 90 days, Board Member Bolton is pushing. Maybe you'll have an extra 90 days to work on it.
Yeah.
But I think that you touched on it as well, and that the community is very interested because of the impact that ESSER funds had on our budgets. And it was great living in the land of luxury, but now reality's kind of hit us where we have to make some tough choices. I think everybody understands that. I think that people just want to know.
Right.
And that's, I think knowledge is power.
Right.
That's that Schoolhouse Rock. We just talked about
Yes.
that, just in case people want to know about that. But keep going with your slides, Jen. I'm sorry.
Well, did we have a question from the public?
Oh, we got some questions?
Great conversation so far. Thank you. Our first question is, how does the district apply for grants?
So that's a great question because some of our grants are not competitive. They're just awarded to us based on the population of our students, right? Those are managed through the Department of Education and what's called the Consolidated Something Application. We call it the CCIP. We speak in acronyms. I can never remember what they mean. But there are a whole host of competitive grants. And then we have a grant writer who helps. Her name is Terry Davis, and she's fabulous. And then some of the schools write individual grants. But, like our psych intern, we have a grant for a psych intern. And of course, you asked me this question, so I completely forgot. Some of our the 21st Century Grants is a perfect example of a competitive grant, right? The Ohio Safety Grant that we just were awarded to help upgrade all of our security cameras and stuff, that's a competitive grant. So those are examples. So there's lots of those. And it depends on who's the host of the grant or the award of the grant and how you apply, where you apply, how much it is, and how it's awarded and then used. And they're all different. Sometimes they're really tiny. Sometimes they're pretty big and they spread over a couple of years. But, like the ESSER were non-competitive grants. We didn't actually have to apply to those.
Are we actively seeking grants? Do we have people that look every day for grants, or is it just that when things big come up, we just renew primarily?
So we're actively seeking. I know that they're working on the possibility of applying for another 21st Century grant. I saw an email come across just a couple of days ago. And so Terry Davis is very busy.
Good. Anything else, Rob?
Our next question, why is CPS responsible for providing grant funds to private/non-pub schools?
Read it one more time. Because
So why is CPS responsible for providing grant funds for private/non-public schools?
So if you want to go back to one of those slides that I showed, the non-public one with the table on it.
Is it that they just give the money, the state to the district, and then the district is responsible for
Yeah, one slide before this,
passing it out?
I think, or one more. Sorry. So the state tells us out of our Title I allocation, so here's one example, our Title I allocation, they tell us how much to give to the non-public schools. And then we have a team that we employ using some of these monies that manages that. So we have a auxiliary manager. We have an accountant that's all she works on is non-public auxiliary funds.
But why does the state do that? Why do they give it to CPS to give to the non-publics? I think that's the question.
Because there are resident students, so the money follows the student and their need, and these children qualify for some kind of special funding.
And they live within the CPS district.
Right.
They just don't attend a district school.
Correct.
And the state considers charter schools public schools, just not
That's correct.
like Cincinnati Public. But then we have also the parochial
Right.
religious schools and the private schools as well. But
Right.
they're all our kids. And I think that has something to do with formulas of monies that we get or our membership. Can you talk a little bit about that? The number of kids we have impacts whether they're in our school buildings or not.
But we report our enrollment. We have a requirement to do that several times a year. The charter schools the funds used to pass through, the tuition used to pass through us, but they are now directly funded by ODE, so we don't have to worry about those anymore. We just have to transport them. But the non-publics are specifically title eligible students, and so that funding follows those students and that specific need. And so they have targeted spending. They have to use that money on those specific children. Because some of our non-publics educate students from several districts, right? So the money has to be spent on our kids, our residents, sorry. Mm-hmm.
That it?
I think we already covered a little bit of this. Can CPS apply for the use of grants from private organizations?
Yes, we do it all the time. But it has to go through a vetting process because sometimes the grant requirements are not acceptable to us. Sometimes the grants require us to pull away from our core business. Sometimes they have these incredible matching needs, or they have these incredible data requirements that it's just more work than it's worth having. So the whole grant application goes through a vetting process to make sure that it's a wise decision for the district. Sometimes in the past we've had trouble with sustainability plans. And so we try to make sure that whatever we're committing to is something that we can sustain, or if it's like a one-time project where you're buying, like the safety grants where you're buying equipment. Many of these grants will hire people, and then when the grant money goes away, nobody wants to get rid of the people because they're great, doing a great job. So then the general fund has to absorb that, and it makes it harder to continue balanced budgets. But yes, we do apply to private places as long as it fits into the strategic direction of the board.
Last question for the moment, but we do have a couple more coming in. How is free lunch connected to state or federal grants?
Free and reduced lunch. So that's sometimes they use free and reduced lunch measures as the poverty index, and that's how the Ohio Department of Education determines which schools are eligible for title funding, for federal funding, and which schools aren't. And so that's how the title monies are allocated.
So when you get the big packets in the beginning of the year, and one of them is the form that needs to be filled out for free and reduced lunch, or just
Fill it out.
Fill it out,
Yes.
please. Don't just. And I know it's cumbersome. I've had 3 kids at different schools, 3 different packets. I don't know why we can't streamline that, but in any event, fill it out, fill out the packets because that's important because it helps with the title funding. Although there is part of the formula that compensates for that, but we need you to fill them out.
Mm-hmm.
Also, fill out the consent forms.
For what?
Medical services, mental health services, vision, all that sort of stuff. And we've, over time, we've gotten very good about that. And certainly people that don't want to do it, I understand, and that's their prerogative. But oftentimes we'll have an issue evolve in a particular school, and did that child receive services or did that teenager receive service? No, there wasn't a consent form. So the consent form piece is so critical because a lot of what we do, although we may not think it's our core function, one of the things we've done so well in the last decade or so is the health services. So the consent form is critical because that is not necessarily transportable. It can be under certain circumstances, but generally, even with our mobility from school to school, if it's a different medical provider, it's not, I believe that makes it not transportable, but it can go from school to school if it's the same medical provider. So we have a dozen or more medical and mental health providers in our district. So please fill out the consent form too.
Well, and it also allows us to ask for reimbursement for Medicaid
Absolutely.
services. So that helps a lot too.
That's very important. Very, very important.
And I know parents, this is cumbersome. I'm closer than I am farther away from it, but if you could just get a buddy and make sure that they filled out their forms, help them out if they need it. We can work on streamlining some of this stuff, but we just really need all the forms filled out at the beginning of the year so that we can really effectively educate and supplement and care for our kids. So,
Okay, so the PowerPoint, back up, please. We're going to talk about our next biggest grant, which is IDEA B. Yeah, so if you'll flip 2 slides, there you go. So IDEA B is lovingly given to us for supporting students with disabilities. And so the purpose is to strengthen and improve their results. And we have to follow what's called the IEP, the Individual Education Plan. And that's developed by a team of professionals along with the parent in determining an individual plan for every student that qualifies. And so these funds are used specifically to address the requirements in the IEPs. Now, these funds have dwindled quite a bit because I remember when I first took over the department, I think our allocation was up to $14 million. So now we're down to 10. So
is that because of enrollment?
No, our enrollment's up. It's up from 8 years ago when I took over as a treasurer. So I think it's just shrinking resources.
If I could, I think I've been fortunate enough to represent the district in federal efforts, in funding efforts, usually through NSBA, OSBA, what have you, and going to be doing that again, representing the first district. But the major reason is that IDEA has never been fully funded. If they would actually, at the federal level, fully fund IDEA, it would change what we are able to do for our kids. It would almost be as impactful as that almost 2 years when they had a certain program that allowed us to reduce child poverty so significantly, and then that expired. But if you really funded, it would be a tremendous impact. But they don't. And whether it's a Republican majority or a Democratic majority, it has never been fully funded. And that's the number one request of any educational lobby at all, is to fully fund that. And it would change so many lives and so many school districts' financial capabilities.
So these funds are allocated out based on the IEP from our Department of Student Services that manages all this work. And they're also subject to the supplement rules. So it has to sit on top of what you're already doing for that child for their normal education. So we use this money to help pay for extra paraprofessionals and occupational therapists and speech pathologists, some of our special education managers, assistive technology, easier to read it than say it, and you know, extra services that a child might need. So in some of our self-contained classrooms, we'll have a teacher and two paras because of the needs of the classroom. So one of the paras, the second para, can be funded by this grant, but the original para has to be with the teacher that's funded by the general fund. So that's kind of how that works. That's $10 million.
This is not based on a school. Like, this is just if a student has an IEP, they're going to qualify for this extra supplemental service.
Yes. And it's all handled through the Department of Student Services. And they are highly audited and there's so many compliance rules. It's crazy, but it's well worth it to help our students.
So just to repeat what you just mentioned, it's not like then Title I, which in part is dependent upon what school a child is in.
That's correct.
This actually does follow the individual child, and this actually is the equity piece or model.
This is an excellent example of equity budgeting, yes. Because it goes based on the, to support the need of this individual student. So that's correct.
Well, this is we are doing something right.
Yeah.
In spite of ourselves.
Yes.
I think it's
in the federal government.
Okay. So the next slide just shows how we use our $10 million, and the majority, of course, goes to personnel. And you can ask me the same question about non-personnel. Assistive technology, hearing technology for students with needs. I'm having trouble thinking of other stuff. Other like specific Braille readers. No, transportation is general fund. So because that's the base.
Even if
what
it's
we have
part
to
of the
provide.
IEP?
No, yeah.
Okay, cool.
They might help with specific field trips or something like that, but not regular to and from school, because that's a responsibility of the district.
So even if they needed like wheelchair access, which is a different type of van or something like that, it wouldn't be this. It would be that still falls under regular transportation.
Yes. I used to know how much we spent on special education transportation, but I'd forget. It would be terrible for me to try to quote my memory.
If I recall, 4 years ago, it costs almost as much as it does to transport one whole segment, whether it's elementary or whether it's the metro piece. Amazing.
For the year?
It's
Yeah,
amazing.
Wow.
So anyway, so that's all general fund. So the third largest grant that we use is Title IIA. It's on the next slide. Improving teacher quality. And this has changed over the years because it used to be about reducing class size. Now it's about increasing the effectiveness of teachers. And so most of the money is spent on professional development for teachers. It's not, and it's shrunk quite a bit too. It's not nearly as much money as it used to be. So $1.8 million. And then some of it goes to non-public. So if you should go to the next slide, the pie chart shows you.
These are really tiny amounts.
Yeah.
Very tiny amounts.
So if you go back, if you think about
all of them,
original, so $70 million in state and federal grants outside of ESSER compared to this $600 million that we spent on the general fund. So it's we wouldn't send it away. It's very helpful, but it's comparatively speaking, it's not a lot of money.
But it does speak to the fact that you need local control, because disproportionately these are local dollars and local families. I mean, people have this idea that the federal government is so incredibly intrusive. It may be intrusive, but it's certainly not sending the kind of dollars that their intrusion almost requires. And it's managed in part by the state, right?
Yeah, so it goes through the state, and that the state does the compliance checks. um, so I chose not to talk about ESSER tonight because we did a whole town hall on ESSER, and as we go through the budget cycle for this year on fiscal year 24, we will be including a more comprehensive budget as we do our public presentations, and we'll talk a lot about redistributing some of our original ESSER estimates into what we need to spend it on now. Some of our needs have changed since we adopted that plan 3 years ago. Question?
Well, I never leave these sessions without more information than I came in here with. So I'm glad to have this conversation. Do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you. Our next question. Has COVID affected the state and federal funding for good or bad?
Say that one more time, Rob.
So has COVID affected state and federal grant funding, good or bad?
So there is a grant there's several, actually there's 8 separate grants that were a result of COVID. And so I would say that's good. So it does impact. It's good because it's added funds to students who need some more support. It has not changed our other grants. Like the grants that we just talked about. Title I wasn't reduced because of ESSER, right? But it wasn't increased because of ESSER either.
This is somewhat related to that, I think. Not sure. But going through the crisis of COVID, this extended crisis of COVID, how has it impacted the things we think we now have to fund that prior to COVID we didn't necessarily think we needed to fund? Or what's the expectation from the public, or what's the expectation of staff in order to deliver the services they want? How has COVID impacted that?
So I'm thinking about some of the things that we've spent using ESSER dollars that we didn't used to do. We expanded the nursing contract is the first thing that pops in my mind, right? We went from a $1.7 million nursing contract to a $7 million nursing contract. So having nurses in every building, even though we can't fill them all, it was something that was really important. Social distancing, and so we've spent some of the money on expanding spaces for some of our schools that were overcrowded, expanding our security. We completely changed the way we do summer school, and I think we're changing it again. But so just addressing learning loss, like, so every school district experiences the academic recidivism over the summer, right? And so they're always trying to deal with that. But we had years of a year at least of students who were learning from home, and so they did suffer learning loss across the nation. And so that's something that we're having to figure out how to add additional resources to get students back on track.
That's a touchy subject for me, so I'm going to ask the question that Board Member Weinberg submitted, or said that was submitted back to the slide for the teacher quality. It was how many actual paras and additional services are being used for this school year with regard to the 2A funding. I think it was the Title 2A.
I have no idea off the top of my head. I'd have to go run some reports.
Okay.
Okay. For Title 2A, improving teacher quality, I doubt there's any paras in there because it's mostly focused on professional development. I know we use some of the funds to help. So, for example, the title schools that do the reading and math specialists, we split fund them between Title I and Title II, 80-20. I'm trying to go off the top of my head. I can't remember ever seeing a para in the title funds.
Okay.
But I will certainly go back and do an analysis and share it with the board on what Title II is spent on.
And we had a great ESSER conversation back, I think, September or October. So make sure you go back and watch that. Maybe we need to revisit it in the spring because people are asking a lot of questions, and then we'll have more updated information as well as far as where we are.
As we flush out the budget, I was planning to do something.
Yeah, I think that the ESSER question will have to be revisited as part of these budgets, whether it's central office or whether it's school budgets. That's still a part. For this fiscal year coming up on 24, fiscal year 24, how much ESSER money is able to be spent specifically on this year?
So when we did the December update to the board and we revised this year's budget for ESSER, we estimated that we would have about $83 million left for the final year. And
this is the final year.
Fiscal year 24 will be the final year. The monies have to be encumbered by June 30 and paid by September 30, or you send the money back. So,
and there's talk that they are asking for it to be extended. There's absolutely no guarantee that it will be, but there is talk that it could be.
Right.
And so that is a possibility as well. But my question is, we know we need remediation services for our students. We know that our students, even our best schools, have done a great job, and they're still not all where we need them to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could use this money, I know Board Member Bolton speaks of fleet or a mini fleet, and I could swear we said that we could use ESSER funds for that, but also
we are
putting whatever we need to catch up our kids, our students where they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
We can't save the money. We can't take it with us.
Right.
So we need to do whatever we can in order. And I just am very interested in hearing plans to get our kids up for specifically the summer, specifically the first semester, while we have some dollars available.
Right, so I think the academic team is putting together some transformative things.
Good.
I did think of another example. The question you asked me about what did we do with ESSER funds that we didn't anticipate doing, and that is having a 100% take-home technology program. You know, we were one-to-one device, 5th grade through 12th grade, before COVID happened, because we saw that digital age coming, right, or happening, but we weren't prepared for everybody to have them at home full time. So we had some families who didn't have access to internet, so we had to go and make that access available. We didn't anticipate having a family technology support line, right, because we dealt mostly with staff members when it came to technology. And then the schools supported the students. So those are some of the things that I think COVID drove us faster. We probably would have gotten there at some point, but it got us there faster.
Yeah, I think wherever we were weak, it was very much exacerbated, and the recognition too, even on the technology piece, the reality that the providers providing that kind of access had decided not to necessarily serve particular neighborhoods because there was not the return on investment for them. So we ended up having to emphasize that as to the city and what have you. Found out the recreation department and the recreation centers didn't have the capability.
Yes.
So that was an eye opener. So yeah, we could look at the lessons learned from COVID. Some of them are quite good and important.
You know, I'd really like to do a shout out to both our technology team and our food service team, because they made it happen. They worked ungodly hours to get devices in the hands of those students and to help families and support. And our food services department kept feeding everybody throughout. And so that took a lot of effort, a lot of good team effort. And so just want to say thanks.
Absolutely. I will say this. I've been very critical of the district prior to serving as a board member, but there's some things that happen very, very well. And so that is definitely one of those things that everyone came together, and we've got some awesome staff, and many of them are in the audience today. And you all, just a shout out to every single CPS team member who has supported the village. It's been great, and I appreciate you all. So do we have any other questions?
Yes, we're running on about 4 minutes left. How do state and federal elected officials affect state and federal grants? So who we elect?
So federal grants are not affected by state officials, elected officials, although they could have an influence by adopting legislation that might have an impact on how we spend it. So, but definitely state elected officials would have an impact on, our state funding formula and state grants. So I would highly encourage those that are motivated to contact their state legislators and share their ideas about how to better fund the district or not hurt the district financially.
And fully fund the state funding formula. We need that.
Fully funded, yes.
We need it fully funded. Board Member Volt, were you going to say something?
Yeah, fully fund IDB.
So, and I'll just take like 2 seconds to talk about House Bill 1 that's out there. And it'll probably change 10 ways to Sunday before it actually gets voted on. But financially, I'm very concerned about some of the things that are in that bill in terms of their plan to reduce the homestead and rollback credits on homeowners on their property taxes. So they give the taxpayers a credit on their tax bill and the state reimburses us, and they want to remove that. So in order to offset that, they want to reduce the assessed value percentage from 35%. So you have a property that's $100,000. The assessed value is $35,000 because it's at a 35% rate. They want to reduce that to 31%, which when our assessed value goes up, that means our state funding formula goes down and our property taxes will go down. They also want to tie all that to what they're calling the GDP deflator. So when the economy is down, our finances will also go down. And so it's very concerning that we're going to be losing some significant funding. And then, they're talking about doing a flat income tax for the state. I'm not sure how that's going to impact. We have a bunch of smart people, smarter than me, looking at all this data to figure out what the real analytics are. But the bill is very concerning in terms of the impact on state funding.
Just a political note. I can't help myself, but that is largely due to a particular political class that has no interest in having public schools. And that's what they're doing. They are defunding it in many ways that they possibly can. And that is the most comprehensive effort ever to defund public schools. And it's largely because in the state of Ohio, charters did not catch on. So what you have to do now is eliminate the charters competition, which would be us. And this is very, very difficult to comprehend, which is why we must spend every dollar the best way that we can, because in the near future, we're not going to have as many dollars. And there'll be even greater responsibility and burden on our local folks.
Correct.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is that elections matter. So please pay attention to when you ask about federal, when you ask about state legislation, the elections matter. And local ones too, but sure, put people in there who believe in public education and believe in the value that we're providing. So anything else? Do we have any other questions?
We do not have any other questions this evening. Thank you very much for the conversation. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, so I just want to thank everybody for being here in the audience tonight to support us. Thank you to my board members. It was a great conversation. I think this is the beginning of some really great change in equitable financing equitably. And so thank you once again. Did you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
Thank you for listening, and thanks for the discussion. And it's all about the budget.
It's all about the budget, and it's all about our students. And so our next Just Ask Jen is scheduled for April the 13th at 6 p.m.
Oh, it's the 13th, okay.
And we are scheduled to talk about tax abatements. I'm not exactly sure if we're going to stay on that
Which
topic.
we probably will not do that. We'll probably focus just on the budget, where we are with the budget. Hopefully the pause will end soon and we get some motivation and some production, so we'll be able to go public. But we'll announce the topic as we get closer.
Okay, but the date should be the same, right? April the 13th?
Yes.
Okay. And we've got a board meeting coming up on Monday, 20th, and a committee of the whole tomorrow. So make sure that you tune in, and we will be back with great. If you have any questions, you're still
Just
taking them
ask Jen.
online.
Yeah.
Just ask Jen. Submit your questions online, and the team will get the answers to you. If you do have any questions for us as board members, send them in to Phyllis, and she'll get them to all of the board members, and then come back and join us. And it's been great.
Thank you.
You're absolutely
Thank you.
welcome. Have a good night.
Done.